Hello dear viewers, a very warm welcome to our channel. In this video we are going to have a look at how to inspect ignition coil of your vehicle. Ignition coils are there to step up the 12 volt battery voltage into a very high voltage that can spark at the spark plug. So basically they are acting as a transformer. It will transform the 12 volts that is supplied from the ignition switch to 20,000, 30,000, even up to 47,000 volt that can generate spark at the spark plug, so that the air fuel mixture will get ignited by that strong spark. In order to do this and in order to transform the battery voltage, the ignition coil has two coils: the primary winding, which supplies battery voltage, and the secondary winding, which will step up the voltage and then supply to the spark plug. Now, when inspecting ignition coils, all you have to do is to check the well-being of the primary winding and the secondary winding. When you look at the terminals of the ignition coil, there are three terminals. There is ignition coil plus, which is coming from the ignition switch. There is a plus terminal, sometimes it is known as terminal 15, and there is the negative terminal, sometimes known as terminal 1. This will go to the distributor in order to be turned on and off by the distributor contact point, if it is a contact point type, or it will go to the trigger, which will trigger this by turning on off, and interrupting the primary current. So basically what will happen is, when current is flowing through the primary winding, coming from ignition switch, passing through the primary winding, and then exiting through the negative terminal and going to ground, when there is continuous current flow inside the primary, magnetic field will build up, and when that current flow is suddenly interrupted, there is a very large change of flux, change of magnetism happening inside the ignition coil. There will be a very fast magnetic field collapse, and that collapsing magnetic field will generate high voltage on the secondary winding. So, in order to inspect, all you have to do is measure the resistance between the plus and the negative in order to figure out the resistance of the primary winding, and measure resistance between the ignition coil plus and the center terminal. Center terminal is sometimes known as terminal 4. Then that will tell you the well-being of the secondary winding. Now for this, select resistance on your multimeter. Right here, this is the resistance value. Select resistance, and if it is this type of multimeters, they auto adjust the range. If it is an auto adjust type, you can simply put it on ohms and it will automatically adjust the range. And some multimeters have a range selector. For the primary winding, you can select the smaller resistance value, because we are expecting small resistance value. But when it comes to the secondary, we will be expecting in thousands. Now let's go ahead and measure the continuity between the primary winding terminals. Right here we have ignition coil plus, and right here we have the ignition coil negative. Measuring continuity will give us, right here we are finding a resistance of 1.9 ohm, for example. So the primary winding has 1.9 ohm. All you have to do is take this value and compare it to the specification for your particular ignition coil. And for measuring the secondary winding, place one multimeter on ignition coil plus and place the other into the center terminal. It will give you in thousands. If there is continuity, it will give you in thousands. For example, right here we are wait for the reading to stabilize. We are finding 9.48 kilo ohm, which is 9,470 ohms. So 9.4 kilo ohm is the resistance of the secondary winding. So this is how you measure the resistance value. If you find no resistance between these two terminals, if you find infinity between ignition coil negative and ignition coil positive, it means the primary winding is disconnected somewhere. That will indicate an open circuit inside the primary. If you find infinity reading between the ignition coil plus and the center terminal, that indicates disconnected secondary winding. If you find a resistance very small, close to zero between these two terminals, that indicates the primary winding has shorted out. Similarly, if you find very small resistance value close to zero, that will indicate shorted out secondary winding. So this is basically how you evaluate the ignition coil. The shape and size might be different, but the principle of testing and the principle of operation is always the same. Simply measure between these two terminals in order to find out resistance value of the primary winding. Right here, for example, it is reading 4 ohm, and then between this terminal and the center terminal in order to find resistance value of the secondary winding. Secondary winding is 4.2 kilo ohm and the primary winding is reading 4.2 ohm. You can compare the value to the specification, and if it is within the range, within acceptable range, you can use it. This is also very old ignition coil. Let's go ahead and measure it. These ignition coils, they usually stay for long period. They don't usually go bad. Some of them are oil cooled internally, that will keep the lubrication, that will keep the insulation in a good shape, so they will serve for a long period. Right here, for example, the primary winding is reading, right here it is reading 4.4 ohm, and secondary winding is reading, for this particular ignition coil, the secondary winding is 9.6 ohm, 6 kilo ohm. It is in kilo ohms. When measuring resistance, we always take the smallest value. The smallest resistance value is to be taken. Right here we have ignition coil plus, which is terminal 15. We have minus, sometimes known as terminal 1. Let's go ahead and check this also. Measure the resistance value of the primary, 4.2 ohm, and go ahead and place one terminal on this terminal 4, 9.58 kilo ohm. So this is how you inspect the ignition coil. If it is functional, if there is continuity, it usually operates. So they don't usually go bad. They will very much be dependable. They can serve for long period. This is sealed, and they can have a capacity of overcoming lots of cycle, lots of operation cycle, lots of on-off cycle. So this is how you will inspect operation of the ignition coil. The other method of testing ignition coil is simply, once it is installed on the engine, you can see a spark that is coming out by simply cranking the engine and connecting this terminal to the spark plug and grounding the spark plug. You can look at the spark. That is another method of very fast method of checking operation of the ignition coil on the vehicle. If you don't have multimeters for inspecting, you can simply connect lines to here. This connected to the contact point, and you can install a high tension cable and then put it on a spark plug. And once you crank the ignition, once you crank the engine, you have to see a spark coming out of the spark plug tip. That is another method of simply inspecting the ignition coil. Well, that is all we have for you regarding a very simple test that you can perform on ignition coil in order to figure out if the ignition coil is functional or not. If you find this video helpful and if you like what has been presented, please do smash the like button. If you are new to this channel, don't forget to subscribe, turn on notifications so that you will be the first to get notified whenever we come up with another video. Until then, stay safe.